an empire that ruled for over 600 years, an empire that stretched across 3 continents, an empire that struck fear into the hearts of Europe, an empire that once stood at the gates of Vienna ready to conquer the entire continent, completely collapsing in just 4 years. The Ottoman Empire, which controlled territories from Algeria to Iraq, from Hungary to Yemen, from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, went from being a superpower to being carved up like a piece of meat by European nations. But here's what they don't tell you. This wasn't just about World War I. This wasn't just about military defeats. This was about decades of decline, corruption, betrayal, a series of catastrophic decisions that led to one of the most dramatic falls in human history. Today, I'm taking you through the untold story of how the mighty Ottoman armies, once considered invincible, fell apart and took an entire empire down with them. And trust me, this story has plot twists that would make any Hollywood movie jealous. Let's go back to the height of Ottoman power, so you understand just how far they fell. In the 1500s, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful force on earth. Their armies were legendary. The Janissaries, elite infantry units taken as children and trained to be the most disciplined soldiers in the world, were feared across Europe. Ottoman cavalry was unmatched. Their artillery was the most advanced. They had conquered Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, something European crusaders had tried and failed to do for centuries. They controlled the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. They dominated Mediterranean trade. European kings would beg for peace treaties with the Sultan. The Ottoman navy controlled the seas. This wasn't just a military power. This was a civilization at its peak. But every empire that rises must eventually face decline. And the Ottoman decline was slow, painful, and ultimately catastrophic. The seeds of destruction were planted much earlier than World War I. By the 1700s, cracks were already showing. The Janissaries, once the pride of the Ottoman military, had become corrupt. They started demanding privileges, interfering in politics, became more interested in maintaining their power than fighting wars. They would overthrow sultans they didn't like. They became a state within a state. The military innovation that had made the Ottomans dominant had stopped. While Europe was going through the Industrial Revolution, developing new weapons, new tactics, and new military organization, the Ottomans were stuck in old methods. They were still using tactics from the 1500s, while Europe had moved on to modern warfare. The Ottoman economy was struggling. European powers had found sea routes to Asia, bypassing Ottoman-controlled trade routes, which devastated their economy. Corruption spread through every level of government. Provincial governors were more like independent warlords than loyal administrators. The empire was massive, but it was becoming impossible to govern effectively. Then came the wars that exposed just how weak the empire had become. The Russo-Turkish Wars of the 1700s and 1800s were disasters. Russia, once considered a backward nation by the Ottomans, was now defeating them repeatedly. The Ottomans lost control of the Black Sea. They lost territories in the Balkans. They lost Crimea. Each defeat was humiliating. European powers started calling the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe. This wasn't just an insult, it was a diagnosis. Everyone could see the empire was dying. European powers were already planning how to divide its territories among themselves. The Ottomans tried to reform. Sultan Mahmud II in the 1820s finally abolished the Janissaries. They had become so corrupt and resistant to reform that he had to destroy them completely. He surrounded their barracks and massacred thousands of them. It was brutal, but necessary. He tried to build a modern army based on European models, but it was too little too late. The 1800s were a century of continuous Ottoman decline. They lost Greece to independence. They lost Egypt to a powerful governor who essentially became independent. They lost Algeria to France. They lost territories in the Balkans as nationalism spread and various ethnic groups demanded independence. The Ottomans were fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts. They were trying to modernize while maintaining their traditional Islamic identity. They were trying to hold together a diverse empire where Arabs, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, Bulgarians, and dozens of other ethnic groups all wanted autonomy or independence. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. It just kept slipping through their fingers. The Ottoman military was reformed multiple times, but each time, the reforms were incomplete or undermined by internal politics. By the time World War I approached, the Ottoman Empire was barely holding on. The Young Turks, a group of nationalist reformers, taking control of the government in 1908 through a revolution. They wanted to save the empire through radical modernization and Turkish nationalism. But their policies alienated non-Turkish populations even more. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were absolutely devastating. In these wars, the Ottomans lost almost all their remaining European territories. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro formed an alliance and attacked the Ottomans. The Ottoman armies, despite being larger, were defeated repeatedly. They lost Macedonia, Albania, and most of Thrace. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees fled from the Balkans into Anatolia, creating a humanitarian crisis. The psychological impact was enormous. The Ottomans had ruled the Balkans for 500 years, and in just a few months, it was all gone. When World War I broke out in 1914, the Ottomans made the most catastrophic decision in their history. They decided to enter the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. This wasn't a unanimous decision. Many Ottoman officials wanted to stay neutral. The empire was exhausted from the Balkan Wars. The economy was in ruins. The military needed time to recover. But a small group of young Turk leaders, particularly Enver Pasha, the Minister of War, pushed for entering the war on Germany's side. Enver Pasha was convinced that Germany would win, and that the Ottomans could regain lost territories and restore the empire's glory. He was also afraid that if the Ottomans stayed neutral, the Entente powers, Britain, France, and Russia, would eventually invade anyway. So in November 1914, the Ottoman Empire officially entered World War I. Almost immediately, things started going wrong. Enver Pasha launched an ambitious winter campaign against Russia in the Caucasus Mountains. He wanted to cut through Russian territory and inspire Muslim populations in Central Asia to rebel against Russian rule. He led 90,000 troops into the mountains in the middle of winter, through snow and freezing temperatures, with inadequate supplies and clothing. It was a disaster of epic proportions. The Battle of Sarikamish in December 1914. In January 1915, resulted in the complete destruction of the Ottoman army. Out of 90,000 men, only about 12,000 survived. The rest either died in battle, froze to death, or died from disease. Entire units simply disappeared in the snow. This wasn't just a military defeat, this was a catastrophe. And Enver Pasha blamed everyone except himself. He blamed Armenian citizens for supposedly helping the Russians, which contributed to the horrific events that followed. The Ottomans were now fighting on multiple fronts. In the Caucasus against Russia, in the Sinai and Palestine against Britain, in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, against British and Indian forces, in the Dardanelles against a massive Allied invasion force, and in Arabia, where Arab tribes were starting to rebel with British support. The Ottoman armies were stretched impossibly thin. They didn't have enough weapons, ammunition, food, or medical supplies. Soldiers were often barefoot. Many units were starving. Disease spread rapidly through the ranks. The transportation infrastructure was inadequate. To move troops and supplies efficiently, the economy couldn't support this level of military mobilization. And yet, surprisingly, the Ottomans won some remarkable victories in the early years of the war. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 and 1916 was the Ottoman Empire's finest hour in World War I. Britain and France, wanting to knock the Ottomans out of the war quickly, capture Constantinople, and open a supply route to Russia, launched a massive invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. This was supposed to be easy. The Ottoman armies were considered weak. The British and French had superior naval power and modern weapons. But the Ottomans, led by officers like Mustafa Kemal, who would later become Ataturk, fought with incredible determination. They turned the beaches of Gallipoli into a slaughterhouse. Wave after wave of Allied troops landed and were cut down by Ottoman machine guns and artillery. The terrain favored the defenders. The Ottomans had the high ground. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned in many sectors, they held their positions. The fighting was brutal. Men fought in trenches just meters apart. Casualties on both sides were horrific. After 8 months of bloody stalemate, the Allied forces withdrew in defeat. This was a humiliating failure for Britain and France, and a propaganda victory for the Ottomans. But it was also their last major victory. In Mesopotamia, the Ottomans had another surprising success. A British force advancing toward Baghdad was surrounded and forced to surrender at the Siege of Kut in 1916. 13,000 British and Indian soldiers became prisoners of war. This was one of Britain's worst defeats of the war, but these victories couldn't change the overall strategic situation. The Ottoman Empire was bleeding out. The British were learning from their mistakes and coming back stronger. They were reorganizing their forces, bringing in more troops, and developing better strategies. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were running out of everything. In Arabia, one of the most devastating betrayals in Ottoman history was unfolding. The British, through officers like T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, were secretly supporting and funding an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. They promised Arab leaders independence if they rebelled against the Ottomans. Sharif Hussein of Makkah, who was supposed to be a loyal Ottoman subject, declared the Arab revolt in 1916. Arab tribes started attacking Ottoman supply lines, cutting telegraph wires, and disrupting Ottoman control over the region. The Ottomans had to divert troops to fight this rebellion, troops they desperately needed elsewhere. The symbolism was devastating. Sharif Hussein was the guardian of the holy cities of Makkah and Medina. His rebellion against the Ottoman Sultan, who was also the Caliph of Islam, shattered the religious legitimacy of Ottoman rule. Arab soldiers in the Ottoman army started deserting. The empire's claim to be the protector of Islam was falling apart. But here's the twist that makes this even more tragic. The British were lying to the Arabs. While they were promising Arab independence, they were simultaneously making secret deals with France to divide the Arab territories between themselves. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 carved up the Middle East into British and French zones of control. The Arabs were being used as pawns. The British wanted them to weaken the Ottomans, but had no intention of giving them real independence. And the Arabs wouldn't discover this betrayal until after the war was over. The Ottoman Empire was being stabbed in the back by subjects it had ruled for 400 years. And those same subjects were being manipulated and betrayed by European powers who saw them as nothing more than tools. By 1917, the Ottoman armies were in full retreat on almost every front. In Palestine, British forces under General Edmund Allenby launched a major offensive. The Ottomans, weakened by years of war, desertions, and supply shortages, couldn't hold their lines. Jerusalem fell to the British in December 1917 after 400 years of Ottoman rule. This was a massive psychological blow. The holy city was lost. Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot as a sign of respect, and the Christian world celebrated the liberation of the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The Ottoman forces retreated northward, trying to establish defensive lines, but they were continuously pushed back. In Mesopotamia, Baghdad fell to British forces in March 1917. The Ottomans were losing control of the Arab territories one by one. The Armenian question during World War I remains one of the darkest chapters of this period. In 1915, the Ottoman government, paranoid about internal enemies after the disaster at Sarıkamış and fearing that Armenian populations might support the Russians, made the catastrophic decision to deport Armenians from eastern Anatolia. What was officially called a relocation turned into a death march. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians died from starvation, exposure, massacres, and disease during these forced deportations. The exact numbers are disputed, with Armenians claiming genocide and Turkish sources providing lower figures. But there's no question that enormous suffering occurred. This tragedy further destroyed what little international sympathy remained for the Ottoman cause. The empire was now seen not just as militarily defeated, but as morally bankrupt. By 1918, the Ottoman armies were finished. they had no reserves left. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Soldiers were deserting en masse. Many were just walking home. The supply system had completely collapsed. There was no food, no ammunition, no medical care. Disease, especially typhus and malaria, was killing more soldiers than combat. The infrastructure of the empire was falling apart. Railways weren't functioning properly. Telegraphs were cut. Communication between different armies was breaking down. The civilian population was starving. Inflation was out of control. The government was bankrupt. And still, the war continued. In September 1918, British forces launched the final offensive in Palestine. The Battle of Megiddo was the death blow to Ottoman military power in the region. General Allenby's forces, using modern combined arms tactics with infantry, cavalry, aircraft, and artillery, smashed through Ottoman defensive lines. The Ottoman armies didn't just retreat, they disintegrated. Entire units simply ceased to exist. Soldiers threw away their weapons and fled. Some Ottoman officers tried to maintain order, but it was hopeless. Within days, Damascus fell. Then Aleppo. Then finally, on October 30th, 1918, the Ottomans signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively surrendering to the Allied powers. But here's where the story gets even more tragic. The war was over, but the Ottoman Empire's suffering was just beginning. The Allies occupied Constantinople. British, French, Italian, and Greek forces divided up Ottoman territories. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 was one of the most humiliating treaties ever imposed. It reduced the Ottoman Empire to a tiny rump state in central Anatolia. The Arabs got their territories taken away. The Kurds were promised a state. The Armenians were promised a state. Even parts of Anatolia itself, the Turkish heartland, were given to Greece. The Straits were internationalized. The Ottoman army was limited to 50,000 men. The empire was finished. The Sultan was a puppet with no real power. Foreign troops patrolled the streets of Constantinople. But then something remarkable happened. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, refused to accept this defeat. He traveled to Anatolia and organized a resistance movement. Turkish nationalists rallied around him. They rejected the Sultan's surrender and the Treaty of Sèvres. They declared that if the Ottoman government wouldn't fight for Turkey, they would. The Turkish War of Independence from 1919 to 1923 saw the Turkish nationalists fighting against Greek invasion. Armenian forces, French occupiers, and British-backed separatists. Against all odds, they won. They drove out the invading forces, renegotiated the treaty, and established the Republic of Turkey in 1923. Mustafa Kemal abolished the Ottoman Sultanate and later the Caliphate itself. The Ottoman Empire officially ceased to exist on November 1, 1922, when the last Sultan left Constantinople on a British warship. The fall of the Ottoman armies wasn't just a military collapse, it was the end of an era. For 600 years, the Ottoman Empire had been a major player in world affairs. It had been a bridge between East and West, between Europe and Asia. Between Christianity and Islam, it had been a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that, despite its flaws, had managed to hold together diverse populations for centuries. Its fall created a power vacuum that the region is still struggling with today. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers, ignoring ethnic, religious, and tribal divisions, created conflicts that continue to this day. The betrayal felt by Arabs toward European powers who promised independence but delivered colonialism created lasting distrust. The trauma experienced by Turkish people from losing an empire and nearly losing their homeland shaped modern Turkish nationalism. The lessons from the fall of the Ottoman armies are profound and relevant even today. First, no matter how powerful you once were, if you fail to adapt and innovate, you will be overtaken by those who do. The Ottomans rested on past glories while Europe modernized, and they paid the ultimate price. Second, internal corruption and political instability are more dangerous than external enemies. The Ottoman Empire was rotting from within long before World War I delivered the final blow. Third, entering conflicts without proper preparation and realistic assessment of your capabilities is suicidal. Enver Pasha's delusions of grandeur led to catastrophic decisions that destroyed hundreds of thousands of lives. Fourth, empires built on conquest eventually face the consequences when those conquered peoples seek independence. The Ottoman Empire's multi-ethnic nature, once a source of strength, became a fatal weakness when nationalism spread. Think about the human cost of this collapse. Millions of soldiers died in these wars. Millions of civilians died from starvation, disease, and violence. Entire communities were displaced. Families were torn apart. Cities were destroyed. The economic devastation took decades to recover from. And for what? The Ottoman leadership's decision to enter World War I on Germany's side, a decision made by a handful of men without proper consultation or planning, led to the destruction of an empire and immeasurable suffering for millions of people. Today, when you look at a map of the Middle East, you're looking at the result of the Ottoman collapse. The borders of Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel are all products of how European powers divided up Ottoman territories. The conflicts in these regions, the sectarian violence, the struggles for power, can all be traced back to this period. The fall of the Ottoman armies didn't just end an empire, reshaped an entire region, and created problems that persist over a century later. So what's the ultimate lesson here? The fall of the Ottoman army shows us that decline is not sudden, it's gradual. It's the result of decades of poor decisions, missed opportunities, and refusal to adapt. The warning signs were there for over a century, but they were ignored. By the time World War I came, it was too late. The empire was already a hollow shell, and the war just revealed what was already true. It's a reminder that power is not permanent, that glory fades, that empires that seemed invincible can collapse in a generation. The Ottomans went from besieging Vienna in 1683 to being carved up by European powers in 1920, in just over 2 centuries. They went from conquerors to conquered, and that's the story they don't completely tell you. The story of how one of history's greatest empires fell. Not in a single dramatic moment, but through a slow, painful, and ultimately catastrophic decline that ended with the complete collapse of the Ottoman armies and everything they represented.